Welcome to the Sulbeck Libraries Festival of Words. My name is Rahel Zoller. I'm an artist and educator, and I'm going to show you how to make a variety of pamphlet bindings today. Let's get started. Let's have a look at the materials we're going to use. Just have a look for a collection of sheets of paper. It doesn't really matter what you use, any kind of colored paper you can find, photocopy paper. But what would be great if you can find 2 cards, which would be roughly 250 to 300 GSM, that are much thicker than paper. Then we're going to need a grey board, or it could be a cork, something soft to pierce into, and a selection of tools, which we're going to look through. You need a Bonefolder. If you don't have a Bonefolder, you can use a spoon or a butter knife. If it has a soft handle, you can use that. A pricker. If you don't have a pricker, you can use a cork and a needle. It can be a regular needle, but I'm going to explain you what is special about a specific bookbinding needle. So if you can get your hands on a bookbinding needle, I'll tell you what's so special about it later in the demonstration. Then you need a pencil, a scalpel or a craft knife. Make sure it's a fresh blade, a metal ruler, scissors, and some thread. And I have a selection of threads. This is a linen pre-waxed thread. Same with this one. Then I have embroidery thread. These 2. They are made out of cotton. Just make sure they're not too thick and give it a try by pulling it. And if it breaks, it won't be useful. We can't use it. But if it will be strong enough to hold it, then you can use it. To use these 2, you ideally would wax them. And for that you need a block of 100% beeswax, or if you happen to have a beeswax candle at home, use your candle and run it through roughly 3 times to give it a nice, neat finish. If you don't have any of these, you can also use tooth floss, which is already pre-waxed and comes with a scent. Before we start, we're going to have a look at grain direction. When we talk about grain direction, we're actually talking about how the fibers are running within the paper. When the paper gets produced, it's made out of pulp, and the pulp is made out of fibers and water. So when the paper gets produced in a paper mill, those fibers are running parallel next to the water when the paper mill runs through the machine. So you can imagine those fibers almost as a shape of a rice corn. So those rice corns of fibers are traveling parallel to the water through the press. And when the water settles, all those fibers end up parallel next to each other. Let's do a test for that. I picked up a magazine, which was a free magazine on the street. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to tear it apart. I'm trying to tear a straight line all the way through. Not so straight as I wished. I'm going to do the same, and this time I'm holding it landscape, and I'm also tearing a straight line. And you can tell straight away that one was easier to tear than the other. So if I pick up the one I teared first, and you might be able to do this test yourself if you have an old newspaper laying around, grab it and just tear it in both directions. So if you pick up the one that was more difficult to tear and you look really close, you can see the fibers poking out. So that's the best way of actually visualizing the grain direction. But why do we need to know the grain direction? Why is it important? So when we make books, we want the books to open as nicely and freely as possible. So I actually have 2 samples. This is a book with the right grain direction. So if we open it, can you see how nicely this flexes open? It really bounces back. It's a perfect binding, exactly the same like this book. But if you see in comparison how stiff this book is. So here I'm flipping against the grain direction. So which way do we want the grain direction to run in a book? Ideally, we want the grain to run from top to bottom, and we call the top of the book head and the bottom tail. And the edge where the gluing is, we call the spine. So we want the grain direction parallel to the spine, so that our sheets of paper flex open really nicely. So you can already see it just is a book that opens much better. But there are different things that happen if you have the wrong grain direction. And this is another book with the wrong grain direction. And you can already see that it's all curved in the front. And that happens when you have the wrong grain direction. It breaks much easier. You can see here in the center, the fibers are actually slowly breaking. And also, if we try to force the book open, you can actually see that it starts to break right in the center spread. So knowing that your book actually opens so much nicer with the right grain direction, why are these 2 books produced with the wrong grain direction? Same actually with the newspaper or the magazine. Is it the right or the wrong grain direction? We teared it from top to bottom and it didn't tear well. So that actually tells us that the grain direction is running horizontal, like the other way, whereas we would like it to run from top to bottom. The magazine and all of the books are produced with an offset printing press. That means they've been produced in a big quantity, a big edition. So when books or magazines get printed on a big offset printing press, it gets produced on a big sheet. So if we imagine on this sheet, the grain runs this way. And the magazine would like to have the right grain direction, they would get 1, 2, not even 3 sheets out of it. And all of this would be waste. So this is actually an economical question, which grain direction you use. So of course, if we produce a small quantity, we can try to get the right grain direction. The magazine gets thrown away at the end of the day. So the idea behind having the perfect grain direction is not so important for the magazine. But then if you are a designer, you can always decide right from the beginning, I'm using a specific paper, a specific size, to be able to work as economical as possible to get as many sheets of paper out of one. And this gets very often forgotten or checked at the very end, and then you have only one choice and going against the grain direction. So, now that you have collected or looked for a variety of different sheets, we are checking the grain direction on your sheets. Now, we don't want to tear them apart to check out the grain direction because you end up without any sheets of paper. So there's a different way of checking your grain direction. And I have actually no idea which way my sheets of paper run. So I'm going to go through one by one, and I'm gently bending my sheets of paper. And by bending them, I can tell which way my grain direction runs. So if it's easier to bend, and you can actually already see by me just bouncing this, it's more difficult to bounce this way. So it tells me the grain direction runs this way. We call this long grain because the grain runs parallel to the long edge. So let's put that here. I have another sheet, and now checking my grain direction. Now this way is much more difficult to fold or to bounce over. So I can actually tell my grain direction runs this way. This is what we call short grain because the edge is shorter, the grain runs shorter to the grain runs parallel to the short edge. Now I'm going to go through all my sheets of paper and make a pile. Check my grain direction. And sort them out. Sometimes it's difficult to tell. If you don't have any empty sheets of paper, just use anything you can find at home. Okay, now that I have sorted out my stacks of paper, I'm going to arrange them. And actually, I'm choosing my cover. These are all quite thick cards. I'm going to go for this one as my cover. And then my white sheets on the inside. Let's use 5 sheets for the inside and 1 cover, which is a card thickness. Then let's have a look at the other one with the short grain. I have also, this is my thicker card, which will be on the outside. And then 5 sheets for the inside. And I'm just gonna collate it however I would like to have the collection or the order of my colors. Now we have 2 stacks of paper, 1 long grain, 1 short grain. For the short grain, we're going to produce a A5 pamphlet binding. For the long grain, we're creating a narrow looking book. So because each time we want the grain to run from head to tail, parallel to the spine. So let's start with the A5 pamphlet binding. Start folding your sheets one by one. Make sure they align perfectly on the edges. Use your Bonefolder from the center to the outside and put it to the side. Do exactly the same with the next sheet, always from the center to the outside. If you would use the Bonefolder from one side to the other, you end up twisting the grain. So always come from the center to the outside. By placing these sheets of paper inside each other, we are creating one section. And at the end, we fold the cover, which is your card Be gentle when you fold it, because you don't want to crease it too much. Use the Bonefolder right on the edge. Don't come in too far, because the Bonefolder can make the sheet of paper shiny. And then place it inside. Now, the front of the pamphlet binding now has a creep. So we call this a creep because all the sheets of paper that sit on top of each other now come out at the front. And we can trim this at the end, which is no problem, but it is actually quite nice to show these colored sheets of paper coming out. So if you don't feel confident to cut this at the end, you can also leave your pamphlet binding like this. To start with, your first binding, I actually want you to do the holes by eye. So we are coming in 2 to 2.5 centimeters from both sides, and we're going to make a hole right in the center. And to do that, you need your grey board or cork, anything soft to pierce into. You don't want to pierce into your work surface, so try to find something that is soft you can pierce into. And like I said before, if you don't have a pricker, you can use just a simple cork and your needle, and basically just pierce in the needle from the back, and you have exactly the same effect. So make a hole. So hold your pamphlet right in an angle, because if you keep it flat, you might end up coming out somewhere where you don't want to come out. So you want to direct the needle exactly where it goes. And I'm showing you now how to do it like this. First, I need to find my center. Once I have it, I'm piercing it all the way down, nice and straight. But keep it close to you. Don't pierce it away from you, so it's easier for you if you hold it actually like this. I just turn it around for the demonstration and pierce all the way down, so that you come out right on the fold. If you come out slightly off center, then just try to practice a bit more. So, next stage is sewing your book. So I'm just going to take the needle and choose my thread. I'm just going to use a already pre-waxed linen thread, and I'm just measure the height of the binding, the height of the pamphlet 2 times and a tiny bit more, and trim it. The special thing about this needle, or bookbinder's needle, is that the eye of the needle is the same width of the needle. So when we go through our book, we're not making the hole any bigger. It makes it a bit more difficult to pierce the thread, but once you have it, we will secure it. But we also won't make a normal knot, because a knot will have the same effect. It will make our hole bigger. So what we're going to do is we are piercing the thread like this, pulling it down all the way, and then taking a long thread to let it travel up and just below the needle. And now we have a double thickness of a thread, but not a knot, but we will also have a secured needle and won't lose it. For this binding, if you want to have your ends on the outside, start on the outside. If you want to have the ends on the inside. What I mean by the ends, I mean the knot. Then you start, if you want it on the inside, you start from the inside. I'm going to have it on the outside for this binding. Find your hole. If you can't get through, don't worry about it. Just align it properly and pierce it again from the center so that the needle knows where to go. Pull it all the way. Leave a tiny bit of a tail, enough for us to make a knot afterwards. Turn it around. Come to the next hole. It doesn't matter if you go to the top hole or this hole. Either side is fine. Pull it. Then, when you're on the outside, don't go through the center again. Skip over all the way onto the other side. Again, no, I found it. Tighten it. Come through the center again. And when you are on the outside, now you can tighten it well. Don't tighten it too much so you rip your holes, but enough for it to be nice and tight. So now you want to come out on either side underneath this thread, because we want to tie this one down. So what we're going to do is we tighten it. Let's make a double knot. 1, 2, and now this can't move anymore. Cut it to 1 centimeter, and you're done with your 3-hole pamphlet binding. What you might want to do, just grab your Bonefolder and clean it up. And maybe just give it one last fold. Here we go. Let's do the narrow book. For that, we're using our long grain sheets of paper. And again, I'm folding them one by one. This time, I'm using my butter knife. Wrong way. And again, I'm putting them inside each other one by one. I'm going to put this on the outside. And then my cover. And maybe use your hands first to direct it where to fold. Here we go. So, this time I want to have even gaps in between. So I'm creating a template for this. I'm just going to use a sheet of paper and just cut a piece of it. And you can just use your butter knife to gently cut this away. Here we go. Fold it in half. And fold the ends onto the middle fold. And the same with the other side. And now we know where to make our 3 holes. Open up the center. And I'm just gonna align it perfectly. And just use your pencil to transfer the folds so we know where to pierce. Get your grey board to put underneath. I'm going to use the pricker this time. Hold it nicely in an angle so that you come out where you want to come out, which is right on the outside of your fold. And pierce it down. Here we go. So now we have an equal distance in between the 3 holes. Cut some thread. I'm going to use my embroidery thread, and I'm just gonna again measure twice the height plus a bit more. Actually, this time we don't need as much, so twice the height will be absolutely fine because our sewing is only right here in the center. If you can, wax it by just pulling it through the wax a few times so that our thread is not too wide and too big. Same thing with the thread. Take the shorter edge, pierce through it, push it down and let it travel up, sitting right underneath the needle. This time we are starting sewing from the inside. Come from the inside to the outside on the center hole. Keep a bit of a tail. Turn it around. Doesn't matter which way you go, right or left. Make sure you don't create any new holes. So if you struggle coming through, pierce again from the inside. Tighten it. Come across. So again, we're going to skip the center. Tighten it really well. Come to the outside. And come out on either side of the thread. Tighten it really well, not too much so that the holes are ripping, but so it's nice and tight. And just do a double knot. And that's your 3-hole pamphlet binding done. We're just going to cut again, roughly 1 centimeter. And you have your 2 bindings done. But if you would like to cut the creep of your binding, I'm going to show you how to safely cut your book. Get a cutting mat. I'm going to leave it on my long 3-hole pamphlet binding, the narrow binding, just because it's quite long and it might be more difficult for me to cut. And I don't mind it too much to have the foredge, to have a front, the creep coming out. But I will show you how to do it for the one we did first. So you can either use the grid you have to perfectly trim your sheets of paper, or you just take your ruler and measure right onto the edge where to trim it. I'm just going to use my grid, align it perfectly. You want to use a metal ruler because if you use a plastic ruler, you can happen to cut inside the plastic, which you want to avoid. Make sure you have a fresh blade on your scalpel. So when you trim it, I'm actually going to stand up because I have more control. You don't want to slip with the ruler, so make sure you're holding it really nice and tight. And when you start cutting with the needle, come from higher up. Don't start all the way right at the edge. You want to have a little run up for the trimming. Don't move and go slowly, one by one. Never try to force them in one go, because you won't have a good edge. And until you can't feel anything else, oh, my very last one is still on. So be really careful when you trim your edge so that your ruler doesn't slip. Here we go. If you would like to join me in the second video, I'm going to show you two more pamphlet bindings. One which is called dos à dos, which means back to back in French. It's a nice binding that opens from two sides. Or a mirror book that opens like this. Two books facing each other.